I have some brief notes I wanted to mention before getting into this video. First off, I originally planned to post this on November 8th, 2024, which was the 160th anniversary of the 1864 election, so I figured it would have been a fitting time to post it, but I fell behind on that plan. Though I did manage to finish writing the script for it on November 8th, I also thought it could have been a fitting time to talk about this since by the time this would have been posted, the 2024 presidential election would have happened. So, by the time this is posted, we now know who the USA's next president will be. However, please try to keep the comments civil and modern politics out of it. I know how divisive modern politics can be. I just brought up this year's election since it's happening around this time. Anyway, I am a huge history nerd and have been wanting to make a video like this for a while. A friend suggested this scenario idea to me, and with the help of some sources he recommended, I was able to do the research for this video. Speaking of my sources, I will annotate the sources I used by number in the bottom left corner throughout the video. In the description of this video, you can see the full list of sources I've used, though if they end up too long, it might be a list to Google Docs of my sources instead, but I'm not sure as of right now. I also end up referencing campaigns and battles of the Civil War for obvious reasons. Even though the political and military sides of the war affect each other, I personally know more about the political side of the war instead of the military side. So, if you want to learn more about these battles or campaigns, I recommend checking out the American Battlefield Trust, as they have great articles and videos on most of these subjects. Also, sorry in advance if I mess up the pronunciation of any of these names. I can't guarantee I'll get all of them right. Anyway, on with the video. By the dawn of 1864, the American Civil War has been raging for nearly 3 years. Weariness caused by the war is at an all-time high, and the amount of bloodshed caused by it was unspeakable. In March of 1864, Grant is appointed Lieutenant General, and he assumes command of all United States armies. Earlier in the war, Grant had noticed the armies acting independently, so his hope was that, so far as practicable, all the armies are to move together and towards one common center. Grant's main objective for this campaign was to defeat Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia, so he told the commander of the Army of the Potomac, General Meade, that Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. The campaigns he planned in support of the Army of the Potomac to strangle the Confederacy took place in the Shenandoah Valley, the Trans-Mississippi, a campaign towards Atlanta, and near the James River to the east of Richmond. Finally, on May 4th, 1864, Grant began his plan and advanced on all fronts, with this date marking the beginning of the Overland Campaign. However, before getting into the Overland Campaign, I wanted to get into the Red River Campaign. General-in-Chief Henry Halleck was the one who made the plans for this campaign. And his plans were for Major General Nathaniel P. Banks to march from the west of New Orleans so that he could link with Rear Admiral David Porter's Mississippi Squadron and troops from the east of the Mississippi River. They would then coordinate their movements into the northwestern part of Louisiana while Brigadier General Frederick Steele pushed south from Little Rock. When Grant replaced Halleck on March 9, 1864, he questioned this plan, but he still allowed it since the troops were already in motion. This campaign ended up being a failure for the Union, and it ended with them retreating. Throughout the campaign, the Union lost about 8,700 men and the Confederates lost about 6,500 men. The Confederate victory was only marginal since while it did repel the Union invasion, it didn't manage to destroy Union columns in Louisiana and Arkansas. As for the Union, this prevented Grant from putting pressure on more valuable targets, such as Mobile, so it lengthened the war. Now, as for Grant's plan for the Overland Campaign, it was for Meade and the Army of the Potomac to attack the Army of Northern Virginia, for Butler and the Army of the James to go up the James River and capture Richmond and advance onto Lee's rear, while Franz Sigel was to go through the Shenandoah Valley and disrupt Lee's supply lines and threaten his left flank. As for Lee, in the beginning of the Overland Campaign, he understood that if Grant forced his army back to Richmond, the war in the east would become a siege that the Confederates would lose. So, Lee made his goal to hold the Rapidan River at all costs. Eventually, as the campaign went on, Grant devised a new plan, go across the James River and capture Petersburg. On June 12, 1864, the Union force disengaged and went south to put Grant's new plan into action. By the end of this campaign, Grant lost about 55,000 men and Lee lost about 33,000 men. These numbers were ones Grant could afford to replace, while Lee could not. In comparison to their forces, Lee lost about 50% of his men and Grant lost about 45% of his men. Grant had pinned Lee into defensive positions around Richmond and Petersburg, and he also greatly diminished their ability to go on the offensive. The next parts of the historical context will jump around in the timeline a bit, as many of these events overlap with each other. since Grant's plan was about concentrated attacks on the South. I'll do my best to keep things in an order that makes sense, though, so it isn't hard to follow. Regardless, starting with Petersburg, Grant's plan was to eliminate the supply and communication routes to the Confederate capital, Richmond. Initially, there was a battle that lasted from June 15th to 18th, 1864, but Beauregard saved the city from being captured. Lee's late arrival ended the hopes of capturing the city, so Grant began siege operations. This siege would eventually last until April 2nd, 1865, when Lee evacuated the city that night, though the Union captured the city the next morning. Before getting into the next battle, something I briefly want to discuss is party conventions for the candidates of this election. At this time, there was infighting in the Republican Party, and Lincoln's renomination wasn't explicitly guaranteed. Behind the scenes, the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, was trying to undermine Lincoln's nomination for re-election. Then the radical Republicans thought that Lincoln might not win a second term since he was too moderate on racial equality and slavery. Lincoln himself had his doubts, and this led to a temporary split in the party. 2 Republican conventions were held, but neither of them were held under the name of the Republican Party. Chase eventually backed down, but the radicals and critics of Lincoln in the party sought another candidate. Since there wasn't another willing candidate, they quickly coalesced around John C. Fremont. He was the Republican Party's first nominee back in 1856. He was also a former Western explorer called the Pathfinder. Along with being a current general, the Radical Democracy Party convention took place on May 31st, 1864, in Cleveland, Ohio. The party platform they ratified called for the continuation of the war without compromise, a constitutional amendment to ban slavery and authorize equal rights, and protection of the rights of free speech, free press, and the writ of habeas corpus. It also called for the confiscation of rebel property, enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, congressional control of Reconstruction, a one-term limit on the presidency, and integrity in government, which was an implicit call for civil service reform. They nominated the previous 1856 Republican candidate, John C. Fremont, for president, and the War Democrat former Congressman John Cochran for vice president. Of their party platform, he rejected the plank about the confiscation of rebel property. After the strong and harmonious National Union Party convention, they failed to pick up momentum and stalled. Even Lincoln's deputies had reported that the convention had been a failure, and he was bemused by this. A week after the Radical Democracy Party's convention, the Republicans that supported Lincoln met in Baltimore, Maryland from June 7th to 8th, 1864. With memories of how the Democrat Party split in 1860, the Republicans felt pressure to broaden their appeal, reflect the national character of the war, and to simultaneously provide a place for war Democrats. So, like how the radical faction of the Republicans rebranded themselves, the Lincoln Republicans rebranded themselves into the National Union Party. Lincoln got renominated unanimously, but when it came to the vice president, Lincoln had put little thought to it and left it up to the convention. Hannibal Hamlin desired to be renominated, but he didn't generate much enthusiasm. He didn't bring any new voters to the ticket, and he would be loyal to the Lincoln administration regardless. To win re-election, they thought outreaching to the Democrats was necessary, so they wanted to put a war Democrat on the ticket. Former U.S. Senator from New York, Daniel Dickinson, was under consideration, though since it could have put pressure on William Seward to resign from Lincoln's cabinet, the convention swung to Andrew Johnson. When the Civil War began, Johnson was a senator from Tennessee and the only senator that remained loyal to the United States after the secession crisis. Lincoln had made him the war governor of Tennessee. Johnson also talked a good game about despising the Southern elite. He started as a poor tailor. To the convention, he seemed like the textbook war Democrat candidate they needed, as he wouldn't have had a big role during the next 4 years. He was nominated on the first ballot. Not even a year later, this decision would come back to haunt the nation and the Republican Party. Party platform they had adopted included 11 major points, which were as follows. Number 1, the Union would be defended and maintained. Number 2, there would be no negotiations of peace until the South surrendered. Number 3, slavery would be abolished. Number 4, the soldiers who gave their lives or were wounded while defending their country would be honored. Number 5, this plank expressed support for Lincoln, especially the Emancipation Proclamation and the allowing of former slaves to fight in the army. Number 6, the government should work in harmony and that only people who agreed should have leadership positions. Number 7, regardless of race, all soldiers would be protected by the laws of war. Number 8, immigrants would continue to be welcome to the United States with fair and just policies. Number 9. They were in favor of constructing a railroad to the Pacific coast. Number 10. The United States should pay off its debt through careful spending and fair taxation. Number 11. This plan opposed European interference with any Republican government in the Americas. Now, back to the war. As in May of 1864, a federal army under General George Crook went south through West Virginia, as he was ordered to cut the railroads that linked to Virginia. General Franz Sigel was ordered to go through the Shenandoah Valley to meet up with Crook. This was supposed to prevent the Confederates from marching out of the valley to attack Grant's flank as it was moving south towards Richmond. Though Sigel was defeated and retreated beyond Strasburg, so Grant then replaced Sigel with Major General David Hunter, and he was given the task of cutting the Virginia Central Railroad. After winning at Piedmont, the Confederates were disorganized, and they couldn't stop Hunter from going to Staunton. And after being joined with reinforcements from West Virginia, Hunter then continued south from Staunton, having his men destroy mills, barns, public buildings, and he allowed his troops to participate in widespread looting. Eventually, he also had the Virginia Military Institute and the house of former Virginia Governor John Letcher burned down. These successes of Hunter forced Lee to send Lieutenant General Jubal Early to defend Lynchburg. This restricted Lee's efforts to take offensive actions against Grant at Richmond and Petersburg. After a 2-day-long battle at Lynchburg, Early eventually defeated Hunter. The Union Army then retreated into West Virginia, which left the Shenandoah Valley and the way north open to Early. With Hunter's retreat leaving the Shenandoah Valley basically undefended, Early quickly moved north. He eventually made his way to Monocacy, and after winning a battle there, the Union forces retreated to Baltimore, which left the road to Washington, D.C. open for Early. He had his men demonstrate before the Washington, D.C. fortifications, so Grant diverted veteran reinforcements to meet this threat. Early had a brief demonstration held against Fort Stevens, but he then called off the attack against the capital. Eventually, Early sent his cavalry north, and they burned down Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, as retaliation for the burning of Lexington. After Early's victories in July, Grant had enough of Early wreaking havoc with both his military strategies and Lincoln's chances at re-election. Grant brought in Major General Philip Sheridan into the Shenandoah Valley and tasked him with destroying both the Valley of Virginia and Early's army. He told Sheridan to follow and attack Early wherever he finds him as long as it is safe to do so. When it came to the valley itself, Grant told Sheridan, "It is desirable that nothing should be left to invite the enemy to return. Take all provisions, forage, and stock wanted for the use of your command, such as cannot be consumed, destroy." Grant had also said to warn the valley's residents, as he said this, "The people should be informed that so long as an army can subsist among them, recurrences of these raids must be expected. We are determined to stop them at all hazards." This area was known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, and it wasn't the first time Grant was frustrated with it. But he also had confidence that Sheridan could handle this task. About a month into his campaign, Grant ordered Sheridan to be on the defensive, as they both knew that Lincoln's precarious political position couldn't handle a defeat. After defeating the rebels at 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill, Sheridan leisurely began to pursue the Confederates south. Since he thought Early was whipped, he turned his attention to destroying the Shenandoah Valley. As Grant had told him, "Do all the damage to railroads and crops you can. If the war is to last another year, we want the Shenandoah Valley to remain a barren waste." A few days after the burning started, Sheridan's men destroyed 2,000 barns, over 70 mills, slaughtered 3,000 sheep, and drove off 4,000 cattle. The Confederates sought vengeance for this, and Lee sent cavalry to reinforce Early, as they began to harass Sheridan's men. After Early's forces were defeated at Tom's Brook, Sheridan was convinced that Early was too weak and demoralized to be a threat, so he withdrew to Cedar Creek. He was headed to Washington, D.C., and he also sent the majority of his army back to Grant. In mid-October, Early found that Sheridan's left flank at Cedar Creek was undefended, so he sent his men there and attacked them. After moments, hundreds of Union soldiers were taken prisoner. Thousands had fled after an hour, and after 3 hours, 7 of the 8 Union divisions had fled. By late morning, the battlefield was eerily quiet, so the rebels began roaming the abandoned Union camp. At this time, Early met with General John Gordon, who urged continuing their pursuit. Early turned this down, but some of his men had been on the move for over 12 hours, so he knew they needed rest and food. He was also worried about facing the formidable Union cavalry, so he halted near Miller's Mill. This would later become something that Gordon called the fatal halt, as in his memoirs, he said this, "My heart went into my boots." Visions of the fatal halt on the first day at Gettysburg, and of the whole day's hesitation to permit an assault on Grant's exposed flank on the 6th of May in the wilderness, rose before me. And so it came to pass that the fatal halting, the hesitation, the spasmodic firing, and the isolated movements in the face of the sullen, slow, and orderly retreat of this superb Federal Corps lost us the great opportunity and converted the brilliant victory of the morning into disastrous defeat in the evening. Nearby, Sheridan had returned from Washington, D.C. before noon and found his army disorganized and demoralized, so he quickly inspired his men and launched a counterattack against the rebels. This defeat led to the remnants of Early's force to retreat and leave the Shenandoah Valley. After this, they never occupied this valley or threatened an invasion into the north again. Before continuing on to the election, I'm going to jump back in the timeline a bit to August of 1864, as according to John C. Waugh, there were three major victories that helped Lincoln's re-election effort: the Battle of Mobile Bay, Fall of Atlanta, and the Third Battle of Winchester, though another source I read mentioned that Mobile Bay, Atlanta, and Cedar Creek were the three major victories that helped Lincoln be re-elected. Regardless, when it comes to Mobile Bay, it was one of the last open Confederate ports by this time. Rear Admiral David G. Farragut was given the task of capturing Mobile. On August 5th, after taking the bay by force, it came as a much-needed victory to the Lincoln administration, as Grant was locked in a siege around Petersburg and Sherman was locked in a siege around Atlanta at this time. As a brief break from all these military exploits, I'm going to talk about what Abraham Lincoln was doing at this time. By August 23rd, the war seemed to be grinding down to a stalemate and there were calls to replace him at the head of the ticket. So, he sat down and wrote a memorandum that he then asked his cabinet members to sign without reading it. This became known as the Blind Memorandum, and it said this: Executive Mansion, Washington, August 23rd, 1864. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. A. Lincoln. 6 days later, on August 29th, the Democratic Convention began in Chicago. Not only were people that opposed Lincoln here, but Confederate operatives were also present. Originally, their convention was supposed to take place earlier, but it was delayed since the Democrats hoped the war would stagnate and that voters would turn to them because of it. Generally speaking, the Democrats were united in opposition to Abraham Lincoln. There was other issues that divided them. The War Democrats wished for the war to be continued until the Union was restored to what it was before the war. On the other hand, the Peace Democrats, also known as the Copperheads, wanted the war to end even if it meant that the South would gain its independence. Lincoln also noticed this division in their party and had said this about it: they must nominate a Peace Democrat on a war platform or a War Democrat on a peace platform. And I personally can't say that I care much which they do. The Peace Democrats seemed to have more people at the convention, but they also agreed with the War Democrats that abolition shouldn't be a goal of the war, and that the Republicans and Lincoln ruined the country. It was on the second day of the convention that the party adopted their platform. Their platform had 6 points, which were as follows. Number 1, they will remain loyal to the Constitution, as it provides a fair framework for all states, regardless of if they're Northern or Southern. Number 2, they believe the war has failed to restore the Union, so they want to end the war and make peace with the South. Number 3, they disagree with the military interfering in elections, and they will oppose it by any means necessary. Number 4, their goal is to preserve the Union, but they also believe the current administration has overstepped its constitutional limits, so they want to protect the rights of the people. Number 5, they condemn the current government for their treatment of prisoners of war. Number 6, they express their sympathy and support for the people who have fought in the war, and that if the Democrats win the election, they will provide them the respect and care they deserve. On September 8th, McClellan's acceptance letter became known to the country, and while he did accept the nomination to be the Democratic candidate, in his acceptance letter he also repudiated the platform he was expected to run on. Now to jump back again in the timeline to the beginning of the Atlanta campaign, which started in May of 1864. When this campaign started, the Union forces were led by Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee was led by General Joseph E. Johnston. Even with Johnston having the largest army in the South at the time, with roughly 68,800 men, his plan revolved around holding a strong defensive position, as Sherman's own forces had about 110,000 men. These men were split between the Army of the Cumberland under Major General George H. Thomas, the Army of the Ohio under Major General John M. Schofield, and the Army of the Tennessee under Major General James B. McPherson. Sherman didn't make blunt frontal attacks like Grant. He used 2 of his armies to demonstrate against the rebel lines, while the 3rd Army would go around Johnston's left flank to threaten his supply line. This strategy repeatedly worked throughout the campaign, so Johnston eventually had his army retreat towards Atlanta from July 9th to the 10th. His failure to attack and this loss of territory shocked Confederate President Jefferson Davis, so he replaced Johnson with Lieutenant General John Bell Hood on July 18th. By the time this change happened, the Union forces were 5 miles out of Atlanta. Unlike Johnston, Hood didn't go on the defensive as much, but this was at the expense of heavy losses for the rebels. Sherman didn't plan to attack Atlanta's fortifications, as he planned to starve Hood out by cutting its railroads. Hood tried to do the same to Sherman's rail lines, but he failed at doing so. On August 31st, the last rail line to Atlanta was cut, and Hood was forced to abandon Atlanta on the night of September 1st. On the morning of September 2nd, the city surrendered to the Union forces. The next day, on September 3rd, Sherman sent an announcement to Lincoln and the officials in Washington that said, "So Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. Not only did the fall of Atlanta set the stage for Sherman's march to the sea, but it also assured Lincoln of his re-election. With Atlanta having fallen, this ruined the last major chance the Confederates had to gain their independence. Its falling reassured the war-fatigued people of the North, including the Republicans, that the war could be won. On September 21st, Fremont and Cochrane withdrew from the race, as they had a lack of support and they believed that being a spoiler in the election could be disastrous. But Fremont also remained critical of Lincoln, and it's possible that his withdrawal could have been part of a deal with Lincoln to remove Postmaster General Montgomery Blair from his cabinet. Regardless, a little over 2 months later, the election was held on November 8th, 1864. Out of the 25 states that voted, Lincoln had carried 22 of them. Lincoln had also won elections held in Tennessee and Louisiana, as they already began the process to rejoin the Union. However, the votes in these two states were invalidated because of constitutional issues. The only states that McClellan won were his home state of New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. When it comes to the electoral vote, Lincoln had 212 electoral votes and McClellan had 21 electoral votes. As for the popular vote, Lincoln won 2,220,846 votes, or 55.09% of the total. McClellan won 1,809,445 votes, or 44.89% of the total. Also, other candidates won 692 votes, which is somewhere between 0.01% and 0.02% of the total. Sorry that ended up being so long-winded for the historical context. I didn't expect it to be that long when I initially went into this, and I probably could have made it way less detailed. Anyway, I can finally get into the changes that would need to happen for McClellan to win the election. As mentioned before, I'm not as well versed when it comes to the war side of the Civil War. Thankfully, the friend that suggested this topic to me had gone to college for learning about Civil War history, so he helped provide some insight to me about it. Though I also read online and in books about what others thought would need to happen for McClellan to win the election. The friend I talked to thought that if Atlanta didn't fall, the election would have gone the other way. On the other hand, on some online forums I've read about this topic, there was debate if Atlanta not falling would have been enough to stop Lincoln from winning re-election. I referenced this earlier, but John C. Waugh argued that the victories at the Battle of Mobile Bay, the fall of Atlanta, and the Third Battle of Winchester allowed Lincoln to be re-elected, though another source I've seen said that the victories at the Battle of Mobile Bay, the fall of Atlanta, and the Battle of Cedar Creek were what scored Lincoln this victory. So, to be safe, I'm going to say the changes in this timeline are that the Battle of Mobile Bay and the Battle of Cedar Creek end up being Confederate victories, and Atlanta doesn't fall. To get a Confederate victory at Mobile Bay, the best chance I've seen was when Farragut said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." He had his ship go over the minefield anyway. Thankfully for him, none of the torpedoes went off except one, likely because of them having faulty primers. So, if these primers weren't faulty, the entire naval force he ordered over the torpedoes would have likely been sunk. Any ships that didn't sink because of these torpedoes could have been taken out by the forts or the rebel ironclads. It's hard to say if Farragut himself would survive any of this, but he might not have since his own ship would have gone over these torpedoes. The news of this defeat would likely hurt Lincoln's re-election chances greatly, especially if the news of Farragut saying to ignore the torpedoes and go ahead anyway spread, as in this timeline, it would have been him sending them to their death instead of an act of bravery like it was seen as in our timeline. Then when it comes to how to stop Atlanta from falling, I talked to the friend I mentioned earlier about this. He said the best chance for Atlanta to hold on, at least until after the election, was for Davis to keep Johnston in charge instead of switching him out with Hood. Since Johnston wouldn't have done some of the fatal attacks Hood did, they could have potentially held the city for even longer, potentially until after the election. Atlanta holding on would deprive Lincoln of the major victory he needed to show that he could win the war. Lastly, for Cedar Creek, my guess for how it could go differently would be that the fatal halt doesn't happen. If Early listened to Gordon and pressed his advantage instead of halting, it's theoretically possible that Cedar Creek could have been a major Confederate victory. If Early remained in the valley until early November after this, the threat of another northern invasion or attack against Washington would also be damaging to Lincoln's re-election chances. So, when the election happens on November 8th, Lincoln would lose in this timeline. I made a spreadsheet with hypothetical totals for what could have been the election results in this timeline, though something to briefly mention is whether Fremont would have dropped out in this timeline or not. With the war going worse for the Republicans, more of them and the Radicals could have gone to the Radical Democracy Party instead, as it could make more sense for them to choose to vote for another Republican instead of a Democrat. I'll provide a link to the spreadsheet I made in the description of this video, so that you can see the results by state if you'd like. I made a sheet that didn't include Fremont in case he still dropped out, and one that did include him just in case he decided to stay in the race. It's hard to tell how much support he could have gained, so I chose a random number as a guess and gave him 20% of the Republican votes. Regardless, without him in the election, McClellan would have had to do 12% better in each state for him to win the election. With that math done, when it comes to the popular vote in an election between just Lincoln and McClellan, Lincoln would have received 2,003,714 votes, or 49.71% of the total. For McClellan, he would have received 2,026,577 votes, or 50.28% of the total. Other candidates would have received about 692 votes, which is about 0.01% of the total. For the electoral votes, Lincoln would have 95 and McClellan would have 138. And in the case Fremont still is in the election, for the popular vote, Lincoln would have received 1,602,930 votes, or 39.77% of the total. Fremont would have received 400,784 votes, or 9.94% of the total. McClellan would have received the same number of votes I mentioned earlier, which was 2,026,577 votes, or 50.28% of the total. Other candidates would also have the same number of votes as mentioned earlier, which was 692, or about 0.01% of the total. As for the electoral votes in this case, Lincoln would have received 48, Fremont would have none, and McClellan would have 185. Of course, this is all speculation when it comes to the popular vote totals, as there is no realistic way to predict what the popular vote could have been in another timeline. I also briefly looked at the elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate elections that historically happened in 1864. For many of them, I couldn't find any data by the number of votes in those specific elections, and in many I couldn't even find who the candidates that didn't historically win were. So, when it comes to the Congress elections, I can't go into detail about who would be in the Congress, but I can give rough estimates of how many Democrats or Republicans would be in each House of Congress. Hypothetically speaking, if every Senate and House of Representatives race in the states that I had flip in this election also flipped for the other candidate, the Senate would be composed of 16 Democrats and 34 Republicans. For the House of Representatives, it would be composed of 121 Democrats and 63 Republicans. So, in total, the 39th Congress would have 137 Democrats and 97 Republicans. While I can't list the names of the senators or representatives for sure, in the spreadsheet I mentioned before, I made a sheet about the House and Senate composition by state. For Lincoln's last months in office, there are a couple major things that could happen during this time. McClellan's inauguration would be on March 4th, 1865, so Lincoln would have slightly under 4 months to get things done. Like he mentioned in his blind memorandum, he could try to work with McClellan to finish the war in the way McClellan would like to do. However, I could easily see McClellan turning down any support from Lincoln, as he wasn't really fond of the president. This would essentially leave Lincoln to handle the war how he sees fit, at least up until March. Also, with the 13th Amendment, that's likely not going to be passed in this timeline, at least not as of right now. It took a lot of politicking for Lincoln to get that passed in our timeline. With him having lost re-election, he likely doesn't have the political sway to get people to support passing the 13th Amendment like he wanted them to. For the war itself, there was something I didn't think about until recently when I was watching a video made by the channel Vlogging Through History. I forget what video he said this in, but he mentioned something about in the case of McClellan winning the election, Lincoln could just move up his plans against the South by a couple of weeks. I never thought about that, but it makes sense. If McClellan isn't going to cooperate with him, he would want to end the war as soon as he could, at least on his terms. While I did say earlier that Atlanta would hold on for longer and that Early would still have been in the valley, it would only have been a matter of time until Atlanta fell to Sherman, Early is defeated in the valley, and Mobile Bay fell to the Union. After that, they could try to move plans faster and try to get both Petersburg and Richmond to fall faster. Of course, it would be debatable if they could move fast enough to end the war a full month earlier than normal, but I think it's theoretically possible. Assuming he does manage to get the war won in time by McClellan's inauguration, this would only leave Reconstruction in his successor's hands. Before he would be inaugurated, something to potentially talk about is the Hampton Roads Peace Conference. This normally happens between Alexander Stephens and Abraham Lincoln on February 3rd, 1865. But since McClellan is the incoming president, they could set up this peace conference with him instead. However, even if this is set up with him instead of Lincoln, it likely has a similar result as it did in our timeline. Nothing. I only say nothing would come of this because McClellan seems set on finishing the war himself, and while Confederate President Jefferson Davis was open to a negotiated settlement, he was opposed to conditions that would restore the South to the Union, which was McClellan's main goal. On March 4th, 1865, George Brinton McClellan is inaugurated as the 17th President of the United States of America. Now, to talk about what he would try to do as president, we have to look at some things he has said. We can also look at how he governed when he was the governor as an example, because in our timeline, he was the governor of New Jersey from 1878 to 1881. His term as governor was marked by careful and conservative executive management along with minimal political rancor. He managed to reduce their expenditures by $400,000, and he had reduced New Jersey's debt by $600,000, which was 23% of their total debt. He also got rid of direct state taxes on the citizens, formed the militia, and he encouraged local industry and trade schools. That's all I could find about how he managed the state when he was governor, but it does at least give some insight into how he tried to run the country. Also, even after the presidential election in our timeline, he held the sentiment that any social and racial questions were states' rights issues. When it came to the slavery issue, he once wrote that I was fighting for my country and the Union, not for abolition and the Republican Party. While he deplored that the slave system was inhumane, he also saw it as an institution that was recognized in the Constitution. In November of 1861, he also once wrote to his wife Ellen, "When the day of adjustment comes, I will, if successful, throw my sword into the scale to force an improvement in the condition of those poor blacks." He also later wrote that if it was his fortune to arrange the terms of peace after leading the North to victory, he would have insisted on gradual emancipation but also guarded the rights of both the slaves and their masters. So, this is everything I could find that could help with figuring out how he would potentially govern as president. Though since he would still strive for some form of emancipation, there is something to potentially mention, and it has to do with John Wilkes Booth. When Lincoln initially suggested expanding emancipation to all slaves and to giving them the right to vote, Booth, who was a supporter of slavery, decided to assassinate Lincoln instead of kidnapping him like he initially planned to do. In this timeline, assuming McClellan made his goals about emancipation known to the public, this could cause Booth to change his plan from kidnapping Lincoln to assassinating McClellan. Though it could be up for debate if he would do this or not, or if he would ever get the chance to. After all, there isn't anything to suggest that McClellan would go to something like the theater which gave Booth the chance to assassinate Lincoln, though Booth could attempt it somewhere else if he absolutely decided to follow through on this plan. So, since I was torn on which way this would go, I decided to talk about both outcomes, one where Booth tries to and succeeds to assassinate McClellan, and one where he doesn't attempt to. Since this video is mainly about McClellan, I'll talk about the potential outcome where there isn't an assassination attempt against him first. There isn't any way to say for sure how long it would take for the South to rejoin the Union, but it could go faster in this timeline. After all, McClellan said time and time again how his major goal was for the restoration of the Union. He might be even more lenient on the South than Andrew Johnson was in some ways, such as on the topic of slavery. Regardless, his own Reconstruction plan will likely be similar to Andrew Johnson's, which required a majority of the voters in the southern states to swear loyalty to the USA. It's also possible that, like Johnson's plan, his Reconstruction plan wouldn't have any plans for the African Americans, except gradual emancipation. I guess this also means he would make it so that the Emancipation Proclamation Lincoln made is no longer in effect, since he didn't plan to get rid of slavery right now. Though, his Reconstruction policy's passing would depend on how much he is willing to make them more moderate to appeal to the Republican-controlled Senate. Though, since his Reconstruction plan includes gradual emancipation, that might be enough to make it somewhat agreeable for some of the more moderate Republicans, since they did want slavery to be abolished. In their eyes, slavery being abolished eventually might be better than never. On the other side, the more radical Republicans might protest this, as they would want immediate emancipation, At least early on, Republicans might be more likely to try and work with McClellan since the previous Republican administration wasn't as successful as they'd have hoped. However, even the 13th Amendment's possibilities of passing in this timeline could be called into doubt. Depending on how fast McClellan rushed the readmission of the Southern states into the Union and into Congress, their votes would be needed to pass and ratify any amendment, especially if he allowed former Confederates into the government like Johnson had planned to. I don't see them voting to pass an amendment that would take away their slaves, though I think it would be more likely that he manages to get this amendment passed before he gets the former Confederate states readmitted into the Union. Since it is about gradual emancipation, it's hard to say what the end date for slavery would be. I could easily see it lining up with an election year, or I could see it lining up with a year like 1880 or 1900 at the latest, though those are also election years. Regardless of what year it was, once the South is readmitted to the Union, the members they elect to the Congress, even if they would likely be Democrats, they might not support McClellan because of this. If this amendment doesn't pass, since he was the states' right advocate, he could at least put slavery into the hands of the states. However, this is something the Republican Senate might fight against even more. If it did somehow manage to pass, this wouldn't be good for the African Americans, because I don't think the South would willingly give up their slaves anytime soon. The best chance for the African Americans in that case would likely be for the Republicans to gain control of the White House, Senate, and House of Representatives in majorities the Democrats couldn't go against. Like McClellan was as governor, he would likely be a careful and conservative president as well. He might try to reduce the expenditures and debt of the country, since that is something he had managed to do on the state level in our timeline. Though it's also way easier said than done to lower the expenditures and debt of a whole country right after the Civil War than it is to lower the debt and expenditures of one state 15 years after the Civil War. He also might attempt to get rid of the state taxes on citizens as well. Also, like he did in New Jersey, he could try to encourage the creation of trade schools and the boosting of industry across all of the states. This could include initiatives to try and help the South to industrialize, which, if they do industrialize faster, that could speed up how fast they willingly get rid of their slaves. Regardless, he might also try to reform the army and militia as well, so that was also something he did as governor of New Jersey. If the South is readmitted into the Union by the 1866 midterms, their own nominees to Congress might be people that don't agree with McClellan because of his attempts at emancipation. It would be a tough time for McClellan to try and walk the line between the Southern Democrats who don't want emancipation and the radical Republicans who want instantaneous emancipation. So, even if more Democrats do join the Senate in 1866, they might be likely to vote against anything McClellan wants to do, with the northern states being generally more populous and having more representatives because of that. And since they generally favored the Republicans, the House could switch back into Republican control. So, McClellan could potentially become a lame duck type president for his last 2 years. Though, unlike what happened with Johnson, there wouldn't be an impeachment trial against McClellan. For the 1868 election, it's hard to say if McClellan would even receive the Democratic nomination again. Especially if the southern states are readmitted by this time, their delegates likely wouldn't go for McClellan. The northern Democrats could potentially go for him. But this could lead to another 1860 situation where the Democrats split into different conventions. If they are smart enough to avoid doing that again, they might select a compromise candidate between the Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. In trying to think of potential Democrat nominees, if they chose not to renominate McClellan, Pendleton could be an option. Historically speaking, he was a leading option on the first ballots in 1868. In this timeline, he is the sitting vice president, so that could boost his chances. There would also could be a drawback since he is tied to the McClellan administration. If Grant is still the Republican nominee, which is likely, it could be possible for Winfield Scott Hancock to be the nominee earlier than usual. He was a candidate in this convention historically, and it could also be part of their hopes to retain votes from the Civil War veterans after they dropped McClellan as the nominee. However, if the convention is still torn between North and South, Horatio Seymour could still be a compromise candidate, albeit reluctantly. I think the nominee on the Democrat side in this timeline would be Pendleton, since historically, he voted against the 13th Amendment, so opposing the emancipation of slavery could have made him the perfect compromise candidate. I could see him choosing a general for his running mate, maybe Winfield Scott Hancock, though that might not fly with the South since it would be a full Northern ticket. If trying to choose a Southern candidate with war experience, I think they would also try to choose someone who remained loyal to the Union. Andrew Jackson Hamilton could be a good option, as he was born in Alabama, and in our timeline, he was the military governor of Texas along with being a brigadier general of volunteers for the Union. Even if Pendleton is a Democratic nominee in 1868, I still see his opponent being Ulysses S. Grant and Schuyler Colfax, especially with the war still being won under a Lincoln administration and with Grant as the general of all the armies, he would be highly popular in the North. He likely still becomes part of the radical Republicans, unless an alive Lincoln somehow caused him to be more moderate. I only say this because I could easily see Lincoln being someone Grant turns to for advice when it comes to political matters. In the election of 1868, it's highly likely that Grant still wins against the Pendleton ticket, just because how popular he would be in the populous northern states. Before moving into the Grant administration in this timeline, I do want to briefly discuss the case where a compromise candidate couldn't be found, and the Southern Democrats walked out again, even though it would be unlikely. In a case like this, the Republican nominees would still be Ulysses S. Grant and Schuyler Colfax, as the Southern Democrats walking out doesn't change this. On the Northern Democrat side, their nominee for president is likely still George H. Pendleton. In this case, they would probably know they can't win many of the Democrat votes in the South, so an all-Northern ticket of Pendleton and a former Union general isn't off the table. Someone like John Adams Dix could have been a good option, but given his advanced age, Winfield Scott Hancock would be the likely choice. As for the Southern Democrat ticket, maybe someone like Robert M.T. Hunter could be a good option in their eyes for the presidential ticket. Not only was he a former Secretary of State for the Confederacy, but he was also a critic of Jefferson Davis. This could at least be a good option to try and distance themselves from the failed Davis administration. Someone like Wade Hampton III could be an option for the vice presidential nominee, since he was a Confederate general, and he became active in politics in the South after the war, as he eventually became governor and then senator. I only see him choosing someone like this so that he could try to win over votes from Civil War veterans and also appeal to the South as well. Though someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest could be a choice for the South, since even if he wasn't active in politics in the South, he was active in another popular organization in the South at this time. However, this unsaid organization might not have even started in this timeline yet since slavery is still around. On the other hand, it's also possible that it would have started, depending on how fast the gradual emancipation was moving along, but I'll assume it would still have started by 1868 in this timeline. In a hypothetical race between Grant/Colfax, Pendleton/Hancock, and Hunter/Forrest, there's no way the Democrats would win this. Unlike in 1860, I don't see the secession crisis being an issue yet again, especially after the Civil War having happened. That's the main reason I don't see this outcome of the Democrats splitting as possible. I just wanted to explore this possibility for fun. So, the 1868 election is likely between Grant/Colfax and Pendleton/Hamilton, but Grant would still win. Grant's own administration would have some similarities to how it normally went, but there also might be actions taken on his side to change the 13th Amendment into emancipating slaves immediately. But that would take another amendment to do so it could either be tacked on to the historical 14th Amendment, or the 14th Amendment in this timeline would be the immediate abolition of slavery. Then what the historical 14th and 15th Amendments were would become the 15th and 16th Amendments in this timeline. The only other change I could think of is that since Lincoln is still alive, and Grant historically had 4 Supreme Court appointments, he could try appointing Lincoln to one of these positions, but if Lincoln would accept something like that is hard to say for sure. I forget exactly where I read this, but I once read something that said Lincoln considered returning to practicing law after his presidency ended, so he could be a potential option for a Supreme Court seat, since Grant seemed to highly respect and look up to him. I can't think of any other potential changes in the Grant administration off of the top of my head, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be any. Just from my understanding of alternate history, the further away you get from the point of divergence, the harder it can be to make predictions. That said, I'll briefly explore the topic I mentioned earlier about if McClellan was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. My understanding about him and things he tried historically, there could be some major changes under a Pendleton administration in comparison to a McClellan administration. In a timeline where McClellan was assassinated by Booth, it likely would have been early on in his administration, probably in April of 1865, like when Lincoln was assassinated in our timeline. But the location he was assassinated could be up for a debate. There's no guarantee he would have gone to the theater like Lincoln did. Regardless, with McClellan assassinated, this would cause George Hunt Pendleton to be inaugurated as the 18th President of the United States of America. Historically speaking, Pendleton had opposed measures that banned slavery and he had voted against the 13th Amendment. So, unlike the hypothetical McClellan administration I previously described, he wouldn't try to emancipate the slaves at all. Because of this, though, he could still become a lame duck president after the 1866 midterms, albeit for different reasons than what McClellan did, choosing not to do anything about the slavery issue, especially after a bloody war having been fought over it, would have only served to anger the Republicans more. So, I could easily see them taking control of both houses of Congress in 1866 in this case, too. Another difference in the Pendleton administration has to do with something called the Ohio idea. This was a measure Pendleton had supported in our timeline that proposed paying off war debts with greenbacks, which was paper money, instead of paying off these debts with silver or gold. However, this might not pass, since in our timeline it was historically unpopular with members of his own party. Though I guess it's also theoretically possible through compromises and politicking that he might be able to get it passed. Regardless, another thing he could try to do is based on something he'd done in our timeline when he was a senator. He had sponsored civil service reform, which eventually became the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. Historically, this was signed into law by President Chester Arthur, but as president, Pendleton could try to pursue civil service reform. This act was used to curtail the spoils system, which was generally used to give supporters and friends government jobs. Instead, this act made it so that these government positions required their appointees to pass civil service tests and to meet minimum job requirements before they could be appointed to a federal position. He might be able to get this passed earlier than normal, but it would likely have the same outcome on his political career that it did historically. The members of his party that were supporters of the spoils system turned against him, so they didn't renominate him for the Senate. That would likely happen in this timeline, with him not being renominated for president in 1868. The Republican nominee likely remains Grant as well, but with Pendleton not in the race from the beginning, I could see what would have been his supporters going to someone like Winfield Scott Hancock instead. After all, Hancock was the other leading candidate on the 1868 Democratic Convention ballots in our timeline. Like Hancock did in our timeline when he was a Democratic nominee for president in 1880, he could still choose someone like William Hayden English to be his vice president, but I don't think he rose to national prominence yet. But we could also choose a Southern Democrat to try and appeal to them. I could also see him choosing a well-known political figure at the time instead, like Horatio Seymour or Thomas A. Hendricks. Regardless of who he chooses, which I think Seymour would be the most likely option to balance out his military experience, he would probably still lose the 1868 election to Grant. However, there are some more major changes to a Grant administration in this timeline than in the one where McClellan wasn't assassinated. It's likely the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would be passed under the Grant administration, since the Republicans likely also control both houses of Congress. He might still try to appoint Lincoln to a Supreme Court position like I mentioned above. The major changes in this timeline's version of his administration, however, comes from the fact that Pendleton passed civil service reform before his administration. Grant's cabinet, historically speaking, was full of corruption because of the spoils system. With the spoils system no longer being effective in this timeline, there wouldn't be nearly as much corruption in his cabinet, if any. So, Grant's presidency could easily be seen as a way better administration in comparison to his historical administration. I decided to end this discussion here, so there could easily be countless more branches in the timeline if I kept going forward with it. While the war still generally ended the same, the major changes come through political policy in the administrations following Lincoln, though, in my opinion, it seemed inevitable for a Grant administration to happen, especially after he and Lincoln won the Civil War together. On the other hand, it's also entirely possible that I'm just biased towards Grant, so maybe any of these hypothetical administrations of his wouldn't be better than the one in our timeline. Grant has just always been my favorite Civil War general and president to learn about, so I could easily be biased towards how I view him. Regardless, I just wanted to experiment with trying a different type of video since I'm a big history nerd. Sorry that it ended up being so long-winded, but I would love to hear what everyone thinks about this type of content and if I should make more things like it. If I do make more things like this, though, I'm definitely going to try and shorten how long of a video they would be. Also, I want to know if there are any scenarios like this that people would like to see me try and do a video about in the future. I considered doing one about if John C. Fremont won in the 1856 presidential election or if Abraham Lincoln wasn't assassinated, but I'd like to know what others would like to see. I'd also like to know everyone's thoughts on this video and if there's anything I can improve on for if I make any other alternate history videos in the future. Regardless, thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope people enjoy it, as this has been a video I've been wanting to do for a while now.